Thou hast ascended in glory, O Christ our God, and gladden thy disciples with the promise of the Holy Spirit, having become confident of the blessing. Verily thou art the Son of God, and deliverer of the world.
Good evening and welcome to the first session of our class on sacrifice. This has been a labor of love for me for several years, studying and reading about the idea of sacrifice just as a project for personal learning. It's something that's been on my mind because having converted from a Protestant background to the Orthodox Christian Church, there seems to be a different understanding between the two, and I wanted to figure out what that difference was. Also, it seems to be a very mysterious subject theologically. There are a lot of different opinions, a lot of different theologies about sacrifice, about Christ's sacrifice, about the Eucharist or Holy Communion or the sacraments as sacrifice. So hope to shed some light on that in this class. We have 6 sessions altogether. Tonight we begin with sacrifice as a welcoming gift. And really we're going to be talking about the idea of sacrifice, what it means to us today, what kind of feelings and attitudes we have with regard to sacrifice. Then we'll look at the Bible. What does it mean in the Bible? What kind of feelings and attitudes did people in biblical times have toward sacrifice, and how is that different from today? And we'll try to distill all of that down into a interpretive principle to help us to understand what sacrifice means, biblically speaking. And I think you might be surprised at where we arrive. It's quite different from how most theologians today and most philosophers and us in our common discourse talk about sacrifice. So, based on the groundwork that we're laying today, we'll continue next week to look at the Old Testament sacrifices and what they mean in light of this interpretive principle that we arrive at. The following session, which will actually be after Thanksgiving, will consider how Christ, through his cross in particular, fulfills all the image or the type or the prophetic symbolism of all of the Old Testament sacrifices. He fulfills and perfects sacrifice on our behalf. After that, we'll look at how, by fulfilling sacrifice, Christ actually transforms us into pure sacrifices. This is a different idea than I grew up with. It's not just, Christ's sacrifice is not just a dead end in its fulfillment, but it enables and empowers us then to continue to offer pure and holy spiritual sacrifices to God through our Christian life. And then the last 2 sessions, we'll look at what are those sacrifices that we offer, and especially in light of this interpretive principle that kind of unites our 6 sessions together. First, looking at worship, praise, the Eucharist. Christians offer the sacrifice of praise, how these are all sacrifices for us as Christians. And then the final session, Christians offer the sacrifice of their lives, how through our faithful obedience to God's commandments and the specific commandments of giving and helping the needy, how all of that obedience and faithfulness on our part is a sacrifice that we offer to God. So that is an overview of our 6 sessions. And unless there are any questions, we'll get started. So today, sacrifice in today's world. Today, we use the word sacrifice often in many different contexts. But what does the idea of sacrifice mean to us today? What feelings and attitudes does it evoke in us? In order to understand sacrifice better, we have to understand what our starting point is. You know, we use this word, but how do we use this word? What does it mean to us? The way that we usually use it. I think we can identify 3 different senses in which we use the word sacrifice today. A ritual sense, ritual sacrifice, metaphorical sacrifice, and theological sacrifice. So 3 different senses of how we use the word sacrifice today. Ritual sacrifice means actual religious practice of sacrifice. Now for us, the only experience we have of that is through maybe books or movies or dramatic presentations. We don't see sacrifice happening around us in Norman, Oklahoma. Actual ritual sacrifice. An example might be Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Do you remember the sacrifices in that? You know, the pagan priest reaching into the person's chest and pulling out their beating heart. Actually, that kind of draws for inspiration on Aztec human sacrifice. But anyway, so that's one example. Another example that occurred to me recently is from, some of you are Harry Potter fans, from the movie Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. At the very end, when the villain Voldemort is his henchman Wormtongue is using a spell to resurrect Voldemort. One of the elements of that spell is for Wormtongue to cut off his own hand, and he says as he does it, "Flesh of the servant willingly sacrificed." And as you can see from these examples, ritual sacrifice, like actual religious sacrifice in the here and now, we have a pretty negative view of it in our culture. We think of it as maybe foreign at best, primitive, or even at worst, occult. You know, we associate sacrifice, actual practice of sacrifice, with voodoo or witchcraft or Satanism even. And when we use that word sacrifice to refer to a ritual, what we usually mean, if you think about it, what we usually mean literally is the killing of an animal, that moment of killing of an animal in a religious context. That's what we mean when we talk about ritual sacrifice. Okay, so ritual sacrifice. We also have a metaphorical use of the word sacrifice. And this, in America today, is the more common use. This is more familiar to us. Metaphorical sacrifice encompasses all the secular ways that we speak of sacrifice. In general, it refers to giving something up, usually for the sake of something else. Some examples are valorous or honorable sacrifices. Giving up something of value for the sake of a higher good or for the sake of other people. You know, think of a soldier giving his life for the nation. We speak of that as a sacrifice, as the highest sacrifice. Or another example would be maybe a mother or a father giving up his or her career to focus on raising their children, you know, like, or the many sacrifices that parents make for the sake of their children. They give up something selfish for the sake of a higher good, the value, the love that they give to their children. So those are valorous metaphorical sacrifices. I'm using the word valorous, like valor. That's what I mean. However, we sometimes use the word sacrifice ironically to just refer to someone maybe who's giving up something of value for the sake of something that's not as valuable. Like we would say maybe like a man sacrificed his family for the sake of his career. Obviously, that's ironic because he should have been spending more time with his family, but he spent it on his career instead. Metaphorically, sacrifice may even refer to a pointless loss where nothing is gained in the process. Just a waste, a loss. It's interesting in this regard, the word victim, the way we use the word victim today. What does victim mean today? Someone who's wronged, or someone who suffers, the target of violence, usually, target of violence. Well, it might surprise you to know that if you look up in the dictionary the etymology of the word victim, it actually literally meant just an animal that is sacrificed. In Latin, it means victima, means an animal that is sacrificed. And it was never at that time used to refer to human beings in this metaphorical way. That's more of a modern thing, identifying the victims of violence with sacrifice. Another example of that is actually the Holocaust. Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews during World War II, that word Holocaust actually means, literally, a whole burnt offering. It's a biblical term that refers to a kind of sacrifice called the whole burnt offering. But that term has then now been used to describe the suffering of violence by the Jewish people. So this is the metaphorical sense. The consistent theme of metaphorical sacrifice is a significant loss, with or without a higher purpose. And then finally, there's a theological sense in which we Christians use the word sacrifice to refer to Christ's death on the cross. Christ's death on the cross, and then also for Roman Catholics or Orthodox Christians, the sacrament of the Eucharist, the Mass, or the Divine Liturgy is called a sacrifice. Now, we don't often talk about that because it's kind of a mysterious idea, like, well, what does that mean? With our current understanding of sacrifice, it's hard to explain why we would call it a sacrifice, but calling it a sacrifice goes back to the beginning of Christianity. We'll talk about that in session 5, but that's a little bit hard to get our minds around. However, we as Christians would share this understanding that Christ's death on the cross is not just a sacrifice, but the ultimate sacrifice. So, what does sacrifice mean to us? In our minds, all these senses of sacrifice revolve around the same core ideas: killing, violence, death, loss, right? In the way I've described it, the ritual, metaphorical, and theological senses all at least begin with killing, violence, death, or loss. There may be some good end that's envisioned to come out of the sacrifice, but that's the basis of explaining, or of our understanding of sacrifice. So what kind of feelings and attitudes does the idea of sacrifice provoke for us with that mentality that we have? So ritual sacrifice, like, how do you feel about, there's not a wrong answer to this, or I should say, to depersonalize it, how do most people feel about ritual sacrifice today? How do you? Negatively, yes.
It's bizarre.
Yes, it's incomprehensible, it's bizarre. Shock, horror, fear.
Uncivilized.
Yeah, that it's uncivilized. Yeah, condemnation, outrage. You can see that with recent cases of practitioners of African religions who come to the United States, and it's a part of their religion to sacrifice chickens or what have you. When they start doing that, people get really uncomfortable in their community. And actually, cities have passed ordinances, and it's had to go through the courts, religious freedom questions and things like that. And I'm not advocating animal sacrifice, because we as Christians don't sacrifice animals. Orthodox Christians, like all Christians, don't sacrifice animals. But here's the question is Jews for centuries did basically the same thing. And, we are uncomfortable with it. So it's an interesting problem to consider. But yes, it causes us shock, fear, horror, outrage. Metaphorical sacrifice, okay, not outrage per se, but how do you feel about metaphorical sacrifice? I think in terms of the valorous kinds of metaphorical sacrifice, we would approve it in other people, but do you want to be a valorous sacrifice? No. So in the abstract, we would approve of it, but we don't want to do it. And then the ironic kinds and just the loss, it's just a negative feeling. We would feel fear, reluctance. Theological sacrifice, finally, we would all say, of course, Jesus is our Savior. He saved us through His sacrifice. But what about when someone comes to you who is not a Christian and says, what does that mean? It's kind of embarrassing, or it can be embarrassing, to try to say, well, this is how we feel about sacrifice in other contexts, but in Christ's context, we feel something different. Why? I don't know. So for theological sacrifice, we feel ambivalence, I think. There are intense believers in certain Christian denominations who might vigorously defend the idea of Christ's sacrifice. And most Christians would agree that sacrifice is important to Christian teaching, but the term is disappearing from Christian doctrine and preaching. So I think the common Christian attitude is tacit belief, but actual disregard. Actual disregard. Pretending that it doesn't exist. A lot of churches you go to, you may never hear the word sacrifice. If you went and asked the pastor, do we believe that Jesus was sacrificed? He'd say, yes, of course. But he's not going to preach about it in a sermon. Okay, so this points us to our problem as Christians. Our problem as Christians is that this overwhelmingly negative view of sacrifice contrasts with the pivotal and crucial importance that sacrifice has in the Bible and Christian belief. We may not want to talk about sacrifice, but it is the heart of biblical religion. In the Old Testament, God commanded continuous sacrifice. Continuous sacrifice. It wasn't just sort of like sacrifice every once in a while, but the phrase that's used in Exodus and Numbers is day by day continually. There was a fire underneath the altar of the burnt offering that God commanded, it shall never go out. It shall never go out. You must keep it burning. And everything else, there was more to Old Testament religion. There were prayers, there were hymns, but everything literally was centered on ritual sacrifice. And God commanded it. In the New Testament, as I mentioned before, sacrifice is the heart of the gospel. Jesus saves us by offering the best and truest sacrifice through the cross. Ephesians 5, verse 2. And by the way, whenever I quote something, you have it in your handout. to read with me. Ephesians 5, verse 2, Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Moreover, in the New Testament, Christian life is identified with sacrifice. You can't have Christian life without sacrifice. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, St. Paul writes, I appeal to you, brethren, therefore, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So this concept is crucial to understanding the Bible. There is no Christianity without sacrifice, even though sacrifice is something, if we're honest, we want no part of. So, having set up our problem, any questions so far? Okay. All right. That's our problem. But what were the ancient attitudes towards sacrifice? How did biblical people feel about sacrifice? The answer might surprise you. They loved it. It was filled with joy. They were eager to offer ritual sacrifices to God. They didn't just do it begrudgingly, but they were eager to do it. Psalm 26, verse 6, as an example of this. And now behold, He, God, has lifted up my head above my enemies. I went around and offered in His tabernacle a sacrifice of joy. I will sing to the Lord and praise Him with the harp. Psalm 106, verse 21 and 22. Let them give thanks to the Lord for His mercies and His wonders to the sons of men, and let them offer a sacrifice of praise, and let them proclaim His works with exceeding joy. The difference in attitudes between us and biblical people points to a difference in understanding. We must not be getting something. If sacrifice was so joyful for them, but their joy is incomprehensible to us, we are not understanding what sacrifice meant to them. The meaning of sacrifice in the Bible, as seen in the Old Testament ritual instructions, was not centered, as it is for us, on killing, death, and violence. Hopefully, no one would be joyous about killing, death, and violence. And I think that's certainly the case for the people of the Old Testament. All right. So, the meaning of sacrifice in the Bible is not centered on killing, death, and violence. What evidence is there for that statement? First of all, many sacrifices did not require killing at all. These are non-animal sacrifices which God commanded in the Bible. So try to follow. Let me explain my logic here. If sacrifice is tied to the idea of killing, death, and violence, then that means every sacrifice should involve killing, death, and violence. But if there are sacrifices that don't involve killing of any kind, then the word sacrifice must have a different basic meaning. So many sacrifices did not require killing at all. Grain, flour, cakes, oil, wine, incense, these were all also sacrifices in the Bible. Exodus chapter 29, verses 38 through 42. Now this is what you shall offer on the altar, 2 unblemished lambs of the first year, day by day continually. 1 lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other you shall offer in the evening. With the 1 lamb shall be 1/10 of a measure of fine flour, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of pressed oil, and 1/4 of a hin of wine as a drink offering. The other lamb you shall offer in the evening, as at the morning offering of the morning lamb. So you offer all the same extra offerings along with the lamb, the companion offerings. You offer it in the evening and the morning both. You shall offer it as a sacrifice of sweet aroma to the Lord. This shall be a continual sacrifice throughout your generations at the doors of the tabernacle of testimony before the Lord. So sacrifice is not just about animals. It's about these other substances as well. These other substances were offered alongside animals in sacrifice. Leviticus chapter 2, verse 1, actually, sometimes grain was offered without an animal sacrifice. It's, in fact, considered to be an important sacrifice by itself. It's not just a companion sacrifice. So the whole of Leviticus chapter 2 is devoted to grain sacrifices. And by the way, so Leviticus, I'll explain, goes chapter by chapter covering different kinds of sacrifice. It starts with whole burnt offerings, and then it goes, so this is the thing, would you expect the next thing named to be grain offerings? I mean, are we going in order of importance here? Whole burnt offerings, grain offerings, sin offering, or thank offerings, sin offerings, transgression offerings, I think. But just to make the point that the second of 5 categories of sacrifice which are covered in the instructions in Leviticus is grain offerings, grain sacrifices, which were burnt on the same altar as the animal sacrifices, and burnt with the same ritual care. There were very detailed instructions about how it had to be done. It wasn't just an accidental thing, it was considered to be of importance. And then finally, there was a second altar in the tabernacle and in the temple. And this altar was actually more important than the first altar. I told you the first altar is the altar of the burnt offerings, where there's a continual flame, where these items that we talked about, animals and other items, are burned. There's another altar inside of the temple itself, not in the courtyard outside, but inside of the temple itself, directly in front of the veil that hides the Ark of the Covenant. So really in front of the Ark of the Covenant is the explanation of its location. And that altar was only for incense. God says nothing else is to be burnt there, nothing else is to be offered there, but only incense. Now you shall make an altar of incense. Aaron shall burn on it fine compounded incense every morning when he tends the lamps. He shall burn incense on it. When Aaron lights the lamps in the evening, he shall burn incense on it, a perpetual incense before the Lord throughout your generations. So many different kinds of sacrifices were made that don't involve killing an animal. Any questions about that? Thoughts? Yes?
Isn't that why Orthodox use incense?
It is why Orthodox use incense. So we're just continuing the services that we use incense at are the Divine Liturgy, but that's a separate case. Aside from that, Vespers and Orthros, the service of evening and morning, which is when the incense was offered in the temple as well. Yeah, as this quote says, that Aaron shall offer it every morning and every evening.
Does it have to be a burnt sacrifice? Because I know there was a custom in Joseph's family. One of his cousins had made a commitment to the church that, because his father used to always, every so often, take grain or whatever to the church. And is that considered a sacrifice?
Well, we're talking about the ancient sacrifices. So just to be clear, that's more of a question of what people do now. But in the ancient terminology, sacrifices specifically had to have at least a portion of them burnt. The Greek word for sacrifice, we see that in the instructions anyway, but the Greek word for sacrifice literally means turn into smoke. Thesia, turn into smoke. Yeah. Any other questions? But I'm not saying that it's not a sacrifice today, but that's a different context. I don't want to confuse the point. But we'll be talking about sacrifices today later on in another session, and bring up that question again. Okay, so non-animal sacrifices. Any other questions or thoughts? All right, so that is one of the pieces of evidence that in the biblical view, in the biblical concept of sacrifice, it's not centered around killing, death, and violence. Another reason is that the killing of the animal was not the focus of the ritual. Killing of the animal was not the focus of the ritual. It was merely a precursor, and I'm going to explain what I mean. It was a preparatory step before the real sacrifice took place. So in Leviticus, there are detailed instructions for the sacrifices, and specifically for animal sacrifice, there were several steps that you did in the case of each sacrifice. And actually, when you read Leviticus, people make a decision that they're going to read the whole Bible, and they start with Genesis, and Genesis is very interesting. And then they get to Exodus, and Exodus is very interesting. Then you get to Leviticus. And it's almost pedantic. They repeat the same instructions over and over again with almost the same words. Almost, because there's minor differences, and that's where the important pieces are. But anyway, that actually tells us how significant these ritual steps were. That care had to be taken to make the offering correctly, because the symbolism and the meaning of the ritual was tied up in the specific way that you performed it. You would compromise its meaning if you performed it differently. So we're going to look at some of those very nitpicky details. The first step in making a sacrifice is the presentation of the animal. I'm talking specifically about animal sacrifices here. Presentation of the animal, which just means that the person who owns the animal brings it to the tabernacle or to the temple. He brings it to the gate of the tabernacle or the temple. The priest comes out, and even though Leviticus doesn't explain this in every case, the priest will examine the animal to make sure that it's a fitting sacrifice, that doesn't have a blemish or a problem that would make it an invalid sacrifice. Presentation of the animal. Laying a hand on the animal's head, or the imposition of the hand. 3, the killing of the animal. 4, which is done in a specific way, slitting its throat. 4, collecting the blood. And applying it to the altar. So it's applied in various ways, either sprinkled or poured or daubed on the altar. In very few cases, it's also sprinkled or poured on other things within the sacred precincts, within the tabernacle or the temple. 5, dismembering the animal, which is just another way of saying butchering. So cutting it into the meat into pieces, preparing the meat. 6, burning the meat. And then 7, consuming the remaining meat. That didn't happen because it didn't happen in all cases because there wasn't meat remaining in certain kinds of sacrifice. We're going to talk about all the specifics next week. But consume the remaining meat that wasn't burned on the altar would be consumed. So, if we're asking ourselves, reading through these instructions, if we're asking ourselves, what's the center of this ritual? There are 2 elements that point to the central step, the most important steps. Number 1 is that for certain things, only the priest can do them. And it's repeated over and over again. Like, the priests, the sons of Aaron, shall do this. And then the priests, the sons of Aaron, shall do this. But other things, it's the offerer who does it, or the offerer can do it, and maybe someone else does it, but it doesn't specify who that the priest does it. So what's more important, the thing that spiritually speaking, religiously speaking, what would be more important, the thing that only the priest can do, or the thing that anybody can do or the layperson can do? What only the priest can do is the holiest moment in the logic of these rituals. Also, there are certain things that happen, at the entrance to the courtyard or just within the courtyard. And then there are other things that happen on the altar themselves. What's most important? Things that happen, the holiest parts are the parts that happen on the altar itself. The altar is holy. And those actually are the same things that only the priest can do. The things that only the priest can do and that happen on the altar are number 4 and number 6. It may interest you that, so if I ask you to visualize sacrifice, like what does a sacrifice look like? I think most of us would visualize tying up an animal and laying it on the altar and then stabbing it. Actually, if you Google pictures of sacrifice, like cartoons of sacrifice or sketches or something, that's what they visualize. And either the person with the knife looks very scary or very pious. But there's somebody with a knife and there's an animal there and he's getting ready to do it. The animals in the tabernacle and temple were never killed on the altar itself, except for the birds, and it's an exception. And anyway, but in terms of the lambs and the sheep and the cattle, all of those were killed away from the altar, and then prepared. So they were killed, their blood was collected by the priests, because the priests have to handle the blood. And the priests have to put it onto the altar. And then the offerer would cut the pieces of meat, and then set out the pieces of meat, and then the priest would take them and put them on the altar to burn them. So hopefully you can see in that context, the actual offering, the actual holy central moment of the sacrifice is giving the blood and the meat to God by placing them onto the altar. That's the way that they are handed over to God. Do you see that? That's the actual sacrifice that's taking place. And so then in that context, what does the killing mean? What is the killing? It's just a means to an end. You can't get the meat from the animal without killing it, or the blood without killing the animal and then, butchering it. Okay. Any questions about this? All right. So the killing wasn't the focus. So what we've gone through so far is that not every sacrifice included killing. When it did include killing, the killing was not the focus, it was a preparatory step. And then number 3, the killing itself was not violent. It was practical. We have this horror. We're like, oh, we slit an animal's throat. Like, that's gross. Well, part of our fixation on killing in this sacrifice is a result of our unfamiliarity with meat production. Where do you think your steaks come from? Animals are harmed in the making of that meal, so to speak. Today, most of us eat meat, but would rather remain ignorant of where it comes from. We buy meat at the supermarket, but we are squeamish at the idea of an animal being killed and divided into pieces. But that's exactly what has to happen for you to buy meat at the supermarket. I think actually we could understand the meaning of sacrifice better if we simply set that aside, and if I told you like a modern day version of sacrifice, go to the store and buy a pint of blood and buy, a butchered, animal, just like the meat, just buy some meat and then give it to the priest and he'll burn it up. I mean, we'd be like, oh, well, that's not too bad. But somehow that killing of the animals just seems so sinister and evil. But again, it's because we are not familiar with meat production. In the world of the Bible, most people lived with animals and were familiar with the fact that an animal has to be killed in order to get its meat. It's just a reality. They didn't enjoy it necessarily, but they realized it's necessary, right? They weren't like, oh, great, I get to kill, my lamb or my cow. But it's just something that's necessary it's practical. It was a fact of life. Killing and sacrifice, so this specific sacrificial killing, was just a sacred version of butchering, like that meat production. It was a practical necessity in order to obtain the materials offered to God, blood and meat. There's a woman, a scholar named Catherine McClymond, who wrote a book, Beyond Sacrifice, a comparative study of sacrifice, Beyond Sacred Violence, a comparative study of sacrifice. And in it, she compares Jewish sacrifice in the Bible and in rabbinic literature with Hindu sacrifice. And she finds that in both cases, even though we're so fixated on killing, that's not what sacrifice is about in either case, Jewish or Hindu sacrifice. But specifically about Jewish sacrifice, this is what she has to say. First, if the animal's death were the sole point of the manipulation, she means the killing, the animal could be strangled, bludgeoned, or executed in numerous other ways. Think about that. Like, if it was about killing, put the animal on the rack and stretch it out, and if you wanted to be violent, you could be violent. They weren't being violent. She says the method described in Jewish texts makes both the animal flesh and blood available for subsequent ritual manipulation as distinct ritual offering substances. They were killed in a specific way by cutting the throat. Why? Because the blood is a symbolic offering to God. We're going to talk about why blood. To us, it's like, ooh, blood. But the blood was important, and the blood was not to be wasted. It was to be collected because of its significance and offered to God. So if you just sort of beat the animal up, you don't necessarily preserve the blood. If you cut its throat and someone's there with a bowl, then they can collect the blood, which is necessary for the ritual. Also, you obviously can obtain the meat by killing the animal in that way. Such an understanding views killing as a transitional element of sacrifice rather than a culminating moment. Animal slaughter is performed with an eye toward providing access to the animal's blood, not simply wreaking violence upon the animal's body. Even though we might not necessarily say that, that's kind of where our horror and fear comes from, because what are they doing to that poor animal? But it's not violence. Again, it's a practical necessity in order to obtain the materials for the sacrifice. She also says this, rabbinic references to animal slaughter. She's talking about all of those Jewish texts that talk about the Bible but come after the Old Testament. So these are actually post-Christian Jewish texts. Rabbinic references to animal slaughter are relatively matter-of-fact. They do not characterize animal slaughter as particularly violent or distasteful. And then finally, this is an interesting point, the slaughter was performed publicly. So the slaughter of the sacrificial animal was performed publicly in the outer courtyard area, so presumably it was not tremendously traumatic to onlookers. There were people gathered around. And again, This was something that in an agricultural setting, people just knew happened. It was a necessary means to an end. All right. So those are my 3 points to kind of demonstrate that the biblical thinking was not focused on killing, death, violence, loss. Tracking with me so far? Any questions or any challenges or any? Yes.
Okay, so about 20 years ago, I lived in a neighborhood where there was a family, unbeknownst to me. I was sitting on the front porch and they slaughtered a goat the Middle Eastern way.
Okay.
And I have to tell you, it was a very traumatic experience.
Yes.
It sounded like a child screaming.
Yes.
And murdered.
Yes.
And so there's a piece that I think in Western culture we can be very intellectual
Yeah.
about the death of animals
Yes.
as
Yeah.
being not really that important.
Yeah.
But I can tell you at that point in time,
Yeah.
I totally understood the sacrifice that animals make on our behalf.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is something in that.
Yeah.
That, there is suffering and death, and that as part of our food source,
Mm-hmm.
and that needs to be acknowledged.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I guess definitely we can have that moral debate, and certainly, like actually our monks in our church are vegetarians, so they don't eat meat. And it's not necessarily because meat eating is wrong or sinful, but there is a sense of compassion for all living things. Yeah. Yeah. And but then the next point I want to make is, but it's interesting that in their context, that was not traumatic for them.
Yes, it was something that they lived with every day because they understood the realities that sacrifice required.
Yeah.
And it's just, wow. I mean, it's one thing to experience it. I will never forget that.
Mm-hmm.
To actually be there will change forever.
Mm-hmm. You might appreciate your food more.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I guess it kind of goes to the same point. It just makes me think that in some ways that the whole context of the conversation is about the fact that we have the luxury of not understanding in our culture. That's why we're shocked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's why that's the disconnect.
Yes. Right. Okay. So we've seen that today our idea of sacrifice is focused on killing, death, and violence. And that is generally true throughout all the different senses of sacrifice and how we understand them today. It's true through many different schools of philosophy, many different schools of theology. And yet, when we look back into the Old Testament, if we really look very carefully, we find that that's not there in the Old Testament. That's not there, in fact, in the ancient world. Because in general, even beyond Judaism, even beyond the Old Testament, studies of ancient Greek, Roman, and even Hindu sacrifice, as I mentioned with Catherine McClymond, show that death, violence, and killing were not central to the meaning of ritual sacrifice in any of those cultures. And unfortunately tonight I don't have the luxury of going into all of the evidence for that, but suffice it to say there is a lot. So ancient people who actually sacrificed did not focus on these aspects the way that we do. How did the understanding of sacrifice change so much from then to now? How is it that what seemed normal and in no way outrageous or weird or strange or evil to them now comes to seem all those things to us? How has our culture changed? Well, I mean, one thing we've already talked about is the urbanization and sophistication of our lives so that we're unfamiliar with meat production. And this has changed our feelings towards animal slaughter. How much more so, though, have we become unfamiliar with ritual sacrifice as a practice? In the ancient Mediterranean world, sacrifice occurred not just daily, but many times a day. It occurred in Jerusalem, in Rome, in Athens, and even in remote villages and shrines throughout the Mediterranean world and throughout that land. There were sacrifices happening all the time. Holidays in ancient societies were actually holy days when you had sacrifices, special sacrifices, in addition to the daily sacrifices. Examples of these are the Jewish feasts of Passover, Yom Kippur, and the others. So, just to give you some perspective, from recorded history, sacrifice has been going on. We don't have recorded history without sacrifice. And in fact, in the book of Genesis, we read that one of the very first things that happened in history, so after the creation of humanity and the fall of Adam, was a sacrifice, actually 2 sacrifices. Cain and Abel's sacrifice. So sacrifice has ritual sacrifice was being practiced from the beginning. Yes.
It would be since the fall.
Since the fall, right. Yeah, since the fall. There were not sacrifices recorded in the Garden of Eden, right? That's true. That's true. So since the fall, there have been sacrifices. But for all of recorded history that we have, we don't know exactly when the tabernacle was set up, when God gave the Old Covenant, but there's some who speculate the date 1400 BC. So that's when presumably the sacrifices of the tabernacle started, and then later when the land of Palestine, the land of Israel, was colonized by the people of Israel, and Jerusalem was chosen by God to be the site of the temple, then the sacrifices were shifted over to the temple. And they continued, through the time of Christ until 70 AD. 70 AD, anybody know what happened in 70 AD? The temple was destroyed by Roman armies. And in Judaism, as we're going to talk about next week, there's only one place where sacrifice is allowed, the temple in Jerusalem, once the temple has been built. So once the temple is destroyed, there's no more Jewish sacrifice. There's no more sacrifice in Judaism, at least in terms of ritual sacrifice. There would be metaphorical sacrifice, a spiritual sacrifice, but not ritual sacrifice. Now, in the centuries that followed, Christianity was spreading. And more pagans were converting to Christianity. And as that is happening, pagan sacrifice is diminishing because the earliest Christians didn't offer ritual sacrifices in the same way that not only Jews, but Greeks and Romans and really all cultures, at least in the Mediterranean, offered sacrifice. So sacrifice diminishes up until about the year 400 AD, when paganism is outlawed in the Roman Empire and Christianity becomes the official and one and only religion of the Roman Empire. At that point, when paganism is outlawed, so is pagan sacrifice. And sacrifice, in terms of ritual sacrifice, basically disappears. Now, it's a gradual process because there were still remnants remaining. Actually, remnants remained in secluded countrysides. And that's where the word pagan comes from, actually. Pagan means a country person. Because after Christianity's rise, that paganism only remained in isolated country areas. But it diminished more and more until basically it was non-existent. And that has been the case in the Western world, in Europe, in America, settled by Europeans, until the present day. That means that there have not been sacrifices, ritual sacrifices, for us to be familiar with for 1,600 years. It also means, it points to the difference between our mentality and the biblical mentality, because all of the books of the Bible were written while sacrifice was going on everywhere. Everyone knew what sacrifice was, not by reading about it in books, but because they experienced it. And they had a kind of common mentality. Like no one had to sort of, read books about what does sacrifice mean? What's its importance? Because they talked about it all the time. They experienced it. They lived it. So, and that was true also of the earliest Christian teachers. What we call the church fathers in Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Church fathers being those early Christian teachers, bishops, for the most part, who wrote about the faith. Interesting fact that none of those early Christian teachers felt the need to explain what sacrifice meant, except for one exception who is going to be our hero in a later session. But none of them felt like they needed to explain it because everybody understood. They would tweak it. They would say, well, pagans believe this about sacrifice, but Christians believe this about sacrifice. Or sacrifice meant something different to Jews than it did to Greeks, but those were tweaks. There was still a basic underlying concept of sacrifice that they shared, and they didn't feel it was necessary to explain. That was all lost at 400 AD, and guess what? After that, Christians start to talk less and less about sacrifice. It's still in the Bible, it's still in the Church Fathers, it's still an official doctrine, Christ's sacrifice, as well as the need of Christians to sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Eucharist, but it becomes a less and less familiar term. In comes the Protestant reformers around the year 1500, after the year 1500, and in the 1500s, 1600s. The Protestant reformers, as a part of their critique of the Roman Catholic Church, they said that the sacrament of the Eucharist was not essential for salvation. Right, because part of the Protestant Reformation was really focusing on, by grace you are saved and not by works. And so eliminating all of those actions that in the Roman Catholic Church of the time were so emphasized. And they still are emphasized in the Roman Catholic Church. And in debates that were happening between these new Protestants and Roman Catholic theologians, they started to debate this question. Well, why is the Eucharist necessary? Why is it necessary to have the Mass? Why is it necessary to have Holy Communion? And the Roman Catholics said, well, because it has always been the sacrifice of Christians. We're to offer a sacrifice, the sacrifice of the Eucharist. And the debate then became about, well, what is sacrifice? And the Protestant reformers said, well, Christ's sacrifice is the only necessary sacrifice. And the Roman Catholics said, well, Christ's sacrifice is perfect, but we also need to have the sacrifice of the Eucharist. So there's these debates that are happening in the Reformation time about sacrifice. And then someone realized, like, well, we don't even know what sacrifice is. How can we have debates about this if we don't even know what it is? So they start to define, they start to make definitions of what sacrifice is. They have to be very careful in their terms if they're going to have a dialogue, if they're going to have a debate, if they're going to have a discussion. So they start coming up with definitions. What basis do they have to define sacrifice? They don't have experience. The only thing they have is, well, Christ's cross is a sacrifice. It's the ultimate sacrifice. So they define the concept of sacrifice based on the cross of Christ, based on the current Western understanding of the cross of Christ around the year 1500, which was focused on death and suffering and loss. And so they say, well, all sacrifices must be about death and suffering and loss and killing and violence. So sacrifice as a concept was basically reinvented at the time of the Reformation, and even secular usage of the term followed the lead of these Reformation-era theological definitions. So that death, killing, and violence became the new common understanding of the word sacrifice. And it's only after that, for example, that people start using the word victim to refer to those who suffer violence, the targets of violence. That would not have been made sense before 400 in the Roman world, because no, a victim is just what you offer in sacrifice. It's just an animal that's offered in sacrifice. Also, I mean, I would make a strong claim, not having read everything that's ever been written before the year 400, but I have not seen any evidence that the word sacrifice was used metaphorically in the ancient world, or there's very few examples. In the Bible, I don't know, there would be very few. But in terms of a soldier sacrificing for his nation, that was never said before the year 1500. Actually, if during this time, before 400, you said a soldier was sacrificing for his nation, they would think that he was offering an animal on an altar to Caesar. So, hopefully that gives you an idea of the process by which we lost the ancient common understanding of sacrifice. I know this is very abstract, so I invite questions.
So, one of the things that has always bothered me about the Old Testament sacrifices is it's hard not to see it as placating an angry God.
Mm-hmm.
And this was happening all around the world,
Mm-hmm.
my understanding of it. It's almost like an evolutionary phase that human beings went through all around the world around the same time, as they were sacrificing people, they were sacrificing animals. And what came to me when you said that sacrifice only showed up after the fall is that after the fall, people began to get really scared of God.
Yes and no. So I'm gonna step back and challenge your premise.
Okay.
So the way that you describe sacrifice throughout the world is the common way that people describe sacrifice now. I mean, so it is the common way that people describe sacrifice now in terms of placating an angry God. However, scholars, looking back at even, beyond Jewish sacrifice, looking at ancient Roman and Greek sacrifice, that element of trying to reduce divine anger is not always there. And in fact, it's not necessarily even there the majority of the time. Sacrifice had a much broader concept. It was there sometimes, in some context, but we can't just assume that that's how they felt about it. And on the question of sacrifice coming after the fall, it is true that we do not have any intimation that there was sacrifice in the Garden of Eden. There may not have needed to be. It's silent. But Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are silent about that. However, the church fathers, I don't have the quotes here, but for example, Cyril of Alexandria, there's difference of opinion, disagreement among the church fathers. There are actually some church fathers who say that sacrifice is the result of the fall, and that God then in the Old Testament sort of condescended to human need to sacrifice by sort of fixing sacrifice. Not that God would have given rules or given sacrificial practice to humanity if we hadn't sinned. But it was only because we'd sinned and because we'd started sacrificing that he wanted to fix it. That's one camp among the church fathers. But another, Cyril of Alexandria, for example, writing in the 300s, says that sacrifice is just a natural impulse of the human being. And when we're actually going to start talking positively about what sacrifice actually means. So far we've just been talking mostly negatively about it doesn't mean death and violence, but we're going to talk more about what it does mean. And maybe with that concept you might see how it is a natural impulse that is then distorted through sin. And you can see that in that first sacrifice that we read about, Cain and Abel, because Abel offered a righteous sacrifice. There was no problem with it. In fact, his sacrifice endeared God to him, whereas Cain offered a sacrifice that was unacceptable to God. But then God didn't sort of strike him down. Then he said, you have the opportunity to fix it. He says, sin is crouching at your door, but you must master it. Anyway, we don't have a lot of time to go into that in detail, but yeah, so there are some different opinions.
Thank you. You said about the Christians, it seemed like when they became Christians, then they dropped the sacrifice as a went because they thought it was a pagan ritual. So the part of being not had to almost come later because people didn't understand another way of thinking about it.
Yeah. So the original Christians both rejected sacrifice because they rejected sacrifice because they saw that Christ's sacrifice is the ultimate sacrifice that then transforms us into spiritual sacrifices, which are better. It's not that the ritual sacrifices were bad, it's that the spiritual sacrifices are the fulfillment of what ritual sacrifices were meant to accomplish. So they're truer sacrifices. But yeah, so the earliest Christians understood what ritual sacrifice meant, even as they were not practicing it themselves. But as time went on, they lost understanding of what that as a concept means, because they didn't need understanding of it. It wasn't something that they interacted with each day. Okay. All right. So, turning from the negative to the positive, how are we to understand sacrifices in the Old Testament, and then by association in the New Testament as Christ fulfills those Old Testament sacrifices? We can begin to recover a more authentic understanding of sacrifice by paying closer attention to the terminology the Bible uses to describe it. So paying close attention to what the Bible actually says about sacrifice. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that the usual Greek term for sacrifice in the Bible is gift. Gift. If you read the Orthodox Study Bible, which has the Old Testament translated from the Greek Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew that occurred 250 years before Christ. You'll see that word over and over again. When you come to offer your gift to the Lord. Numbers 28 verses 1 and 2 is an example that I've given you. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command the children of Israel and say to them, my gifts, my presents, my burnt offerings, you shall take care to offer me as a sweet aroma in my feasts." So gifts, presents even, presents. Gifts, presents, and offerings, those are different synonyms for sacrifice. Especially in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but also less frequently the word gift is used in the Hebrew. There's less examples. There are certain Hebrew words that don't literally mean gift that the Greek translates as gift in order to capture their meaning, their connotation. Now, Jesus follows this same terminology in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:23 through 24. Jesus said, "So if you are offering your gift at the altar," that's talking about sacrifice, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. So remember that the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the New Testament terminology usually follows the Greek of the Septuagint, the Greek of the Old Testament Greek translation. Now, when it comes to Hebrew in the Old Testament, the common Hebrew term for sacrifice is korban. Korban. Which interestingly in Arabic there's the word for offering, urban, which is just, Arabic and Hebrew are related etymologically. It's just dropping the Q. Urban, it's the same word, korban. In Hebrew, that became a technical term for sacrifice. And so it's hard to be very certain about its etymology. Actually, certain very important words in the Hebrew of the Bible ceased to be used in non-biblical contexts. So then it's hard for us to really triangulate the meaning. We don't have other references to bring to bear. However, scholars today see, they think that the root, I keep doing that, the root, I'm so excited. Scholars today see that the root is a present brought when approaching someone. A present brought when approaching someone. And actually that's because the word korban probably comes from a Semitic root meaning to approach. Something that approaches or something that's brought in approach. So a present brought in approaching someone. And I think a non-sacrificial corollary to this word korban is seen in the story of Jacob and Esau. This is actually the story of Jacob and Esau later in life, after they had become estranged, and Jacob wanted to be reconciled to his brother Esau. So we read this, Genesis chapter 32, verses 13 through 20. So Jacob lodged there that night and took from what he had with him a present for his brother Esau. 200 she-goats and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milch camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 she-asses and 10 he-asses. These he delivered into the hands of his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, "Pass on before me and put a space between drove and drove." He instructed the foremost, so the drove means like a herd. When he instructed the foremost group, the foremost herd, those who were tending them, When Esau, my brother, meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these before you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third, and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So this is an example of sending presents before yourself in order to have a relationship to reconcile with someone. All right, so gift terminology, present terminology, is very commonly used with regard to sacrifice. Also, sacrifice is referred to as an attractive fragrance. These are all little details that you might skip over because you're like, well, why is it saying that? But when we pay attention to them, we can kind of connect some dots to see what's going on here. Another common biblical way of speaking about sacrifice is as a sweet aroma or fragrance, a fragrance of sweet odor. For example, we read a quote from Exodus. Let's see what page it's on for you. Exodus 28:38 on page 3. Towards the bottom it says, you shall offer it as a sacrifice of sweet aroma to the Lord. That's actually another very redundant description of sacrifice that happens over and over again in the ritual instructions. Specifically, it is acceptable sacrifices that were a sweet aroma, attracting God's attention like perfume. Corrupted sacrifices, or sacrifices that might be accompanied by evil intent, could be described as a foul odor. Now, it's easy to understand how incense could be called a sweet aroma, because it is. It's actually the most literal sweet aroma of sacrifice. But also, the burning of all the other offerings, when it's done acceptably, is referred to as an odor of sweet smelling fragrance. And in fact, I haven't given you this quote, but Christ is said to have offered... Actually, I did give you the quote, didn't I? Ephesians 5, verse 2. Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So that idea of fragrance or sweet smell is a common way of describing especially good and acceptable sacrifice. And then finally, sacrifice is described as food. And it is significant that almost all of the offerings that are made in sacrifice are food. Specifically, the animals that are offered are domesticated animals, right? You don't go out and sacrifice snakes or mice, or, you offer animals that you yourself also eat as food. Sheep, goats, oxen. Beyond the animals, you have grain, and not just like whole grain. Sometimes it's whole grain that you offer. Sometimes it's flour, ground grain that you offer. But sometimes you actually make cakes. It instructs you to make cakes of grain to offer to God to be burnt on the altar as a sacrifice. Wine, oil, these are all food items. Actually, the only exception is incense. But as we've seen, there's another explanation for why incense is a sacrifice. That's sweet fragrance. In fact, in the original Hebrew, sacrifices are called the food of God. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 6. The priests shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the offerings by fire to the Lord, the bread or food, because the Hebrew word for bread can also mean food, of their God. Therefore, they shall be holy. So sacrifices are called the bread or food of God. And a biblical scholar more recently wrote in a book from, I think, 2005 or 2006, Jonathan Clawens. He wrote, "The Hebrew Bible is full of sacrificial idioms based on the idea that sacrifices are divine food, including my table." God receives food on his table, metaphorically speaking, symbolically speaking. The food of his God, Leviticus 21:22, and my food, Numbers 28:2. Moreover, the tabernacle was furnished with a table on which bread was regularly offered. So that's the table of the showbread, which we'll talk about next week. So all of the sacrifices, except for incense, were food offerings. Of course, God does not need to eat, but the food offering is symbolic. These are gifts, as we said, and as we say about gifts, it's the thought that counts. Actually, literally, in this case, it's only the thought that counts, because God doesn't need our gifts. So what are the thoughts that are conveyed symbolically by food gifts?
I keep feeling like it's all about love, demonstration of love for God.
Yes?
In one form or another. I don't know what everything represents.
Yes, yes.
But it's love.
Yes.
If you love someone, you want to give them a gift.
Yes. Yes.
And food to me is primal.
Yes.
It goes all the way back. As an infant, that's the first thing you need.
Yes.
So it's very primal.
Yeah, yeah. Way to a man's heart is through his stomach.
Yes.
You know, when we welcome someone into our homes, we put out food for them.
Right.
When we have important guests, the more we want to show welcome, the more effort we go to have, even better and better food or more and more food, especially in Arabic families. Also, food symbolizes fellowship. Breaking bread together, eating together. It's symbolic of hospitality and fellowship and love, more generally. The food of sacrifice, it's important to note, was not just for God. It was all offered to God. It was an offering to God, but guess what? In certain sacrifices, portions of the food were returned to the priest and to the offerer to eat. The best portions were offered to God on the altar because he's the most honored guest at the dinner. The next best were eaten by the priest in the holy courtyard, and it was considered, he had to be ritually pure. It was considered an act of worship, an act of fellowship and communion with God, eating that second portion of the meat. And then in certain sacrifices, as we'll talk about next week, the remainder could be eaten by the worshipers as a holy meal within the area of the temple. And they also had to be ritually pure, which meant that this was considered an act of worship, an act of communion with God. So sacrifice in those particular cases becomes a meal of fellowship, incorporating God, the priest, and the fellowship, the worshipers, the lay people. And this element of shared meal fellowship is reflected in Deuteronomy 12, verses 5 through 7. These are instructions where God is telling the people that they can only sacrifice at Jerusalem once he has established the temple in the city that he has chosen, or the place that he's chosen. He says, but you shall seek the place which the Lord your God will choose out. I'm sorry, this is Moses relating what God said to him. You shall seek the place which the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. The temple is his habitation, his dwelling. Thither you shall go, and thither you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, and the offering that you present, your votive offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. In the New Testament, St. Paul emphasizes the way that participating in sacrifice creates table fellowship. Table fellowship with the being that the sacrifice is offered to, the divine or spiritual being. We're going to see that it's not always divine in this case. As well as those that you are worshiping with. That there is a bond that's created that's comparable to table fellowship. Okay, 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through 22. Therefore, my beloved, shun the worship of idols. I speak as to sensible men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not participation in the blood of Christ? What's he talking about here? The Eucharist, Holy Communion. The bread which we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. So he's saying by partaking of the sacrifice of the Eucharist together, we are united not only with God, but also with each other. He goes on, consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? What do I imply then? That the food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? He's talking about food that was sacrificed to idol, and then the remaining portions were distributed for eating. And he's saying, well, it's not that we're scared of the idols or scared of the demons. No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. Because if you eat the food of the sacrifice, you have communion with whoever the sacrifice has been made to. In the case of pagan worship with the demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord, the Eucharist, and the table of demons, the pagan sacrifices. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? All right. So, gifts, especially gifts to foster relationships, sweet fragrance, which is also an act of hospitality. Think about in your homes, when you welcome someone into your home, not only you would provide food, but you might light some scented candles. We spray ourselves with cologne or perfume in order to foster relationships. I mean, all of these things, these are familiar concepts. We're just not familiar with associating them with sacrifice. And then finally, food, table fellowship. So drawing together all these clues, we are led to an altogether different concept of sacrifice. Sacrifice as welcoming gifts. Gifts brought to God in order to seek a relationship with Him, as Jacob sent gifts to Esau in order to reconcile with him. Ways of attracting God's attention and favor as a fragrance attracts our attention. Symbolic offerings of meal fellowship with God and with one another in God's presence. In light of these biblical themes, we can best understand sacrifices as welcoming gifts, inviting God into the lives of the people. And this is one example of a cultural feature that was very prominent in cultures throughout the Mediterranean world and really throughout the world. Ancient cultures throughout the world had this, for the most part, in common. That relationships were built through gift giving. through, in fact, very ritualized and stylized gift giving. I'm talking about relationships between people. What are called friend-making gifts. It was a commonplace in ancient cultures, and it's still seen in modern cultures. Right? So, when a man wants a woman to marry him, he gives her a gift, a ring. Right? Before that point, he hopefully gives her other gifts like chocolates and flowers, symbolic gifts. Afterwards, hopefully, he does the same thing. So, and she may give him gifts as well. She probably does. Friends and family give gifts to each other, especially on special occasions. Think about birthdays. And what makes gift giving different from a business transaction? I mean, that actually puzzled me when I was young, because I was like, so on Christmas, we all exchange things of nearly equal value. Why don't we just keep our money? You know, like, we'll simplify things. We'll just simplify it. But that's too practical, because what's the point? What makes it different? It's the thought that counts, and it's the relationship that's the aim of it. Yeah. And, right, exactly. It's not just about exchanging gift cards or checks or cash. What makes gifts especially meaningful is when those gifts have some symbolic value. Among ancient people, these gift-giving customs were much more prominent and ritualized. The giving of gifts was part of many social scripts and was actually expected in every aspect of relationship building. If you wanted to do business with someone, you would exchange gifts. When rulers wanted to meet together to work out treaties or things like that, before they talked any business, they'd present their gifts. Friend-making gifts were tokens of goodwill and faithfulness. This is the thought that counts. Tokens of goodwill and faithfulness, symbolizing goodwill and faithfulness, which are the building blocks of relationships. By offering gifts, the parties pledged to show goodwill and faithfulness to one another in their dealings. And if they followed through, then their actions fulfilled the symbolic pledge of their gifts. But if they failed to do so, then their gifts were exposed as empty promises or even as deceptions. Next, this is the new interpretive key that I want to propose for how we understand sacrifices in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the present day. That sacrifices are welcoming gifts presented to God in order to build relationship with Him. And so next week we'll look at the Old Testament sacrifices through this lens and see both what their purpose was, why God gave them to the people of Israel, and how they failed to be effective in developing that and fostering that relationship which they were intended to build. All right, any final questions or thoughts? I'll see you all next week.